varieties are now in the USDA seed vault. They collected over 75 different heirloom varieties. So the germplasm is there. We're concerned about the traditions and the history behind the varieties. We would like to collect more of that from these original stewards, and then also find the next generation of stewards. It would be a shame if the way that people in the South connect with college would only be using it in a restaurant when the tradition is much deeper than that, much richer than that, and that diversity has always been carried on by people growing these varieties, these unique regional varieties in their gardens, saving seed from it in their gardens, and then doing that generation after generation. Yeah, Ira.
So these people who are interested,
Yes.
in seed stories are here. I'm saying through various accidents, like some person from Southern Living, when they just did a story that, and a person interviewed me and mentioned about 2 sentences worth of this, and every day I've been getting 2 or 3 people who want to steward, and I think some people here would be excellent future stewards, adoptive parents of one of these lovely varieties. So, where I hang out. You come on by and give me your name, and as the project evolves, I will keep you in touch.
Yeah, but we're hoping that that'll be a nice opportunity to, we're hoping that with a little bit of active intervention that we can help keep this tradition alive and thriving for future generations to come. This particular collard, it comes to us from Naomi Willis of North Carolina, and it's a variety that had been passed down to her from her grandmother. She said, for 60 years or more, my mother saved these seeds from her mother to raise collards for summer greens and also winter. They will grow as big as a wash tub, about 3 feet across. I do not know where she got them. I do not like to see them be lost. She says, collard worms and terrapin bugs also love collard plants. As a child, I was given a small empty milk can containing a pitcher of water and kerosene in which to collect the pest each day. I hated the job, but was paid 5 cents for each can full. And she also shared a method of preservation that her mother-in-law Ada used. She said that after a couple of heavy frosts, she would pull up the entire plant, cut off the roots and throw away any fading leaves and bugs, and then wash the entire plant in a tub of water. Next, she would put that plant upside down in a pot of boiling water for a minute, and then that wilted collard was hung upside down on a fence to allow it to dry. Then they would store that whole plant in a clean flour sack until they needed it. And then they reconstitute this kind of dried collard by putting a handful of leaves in a pot of water, and usually with they use it to cook meat with. And that way they could use collard greens all winter long, even though it wasn't harvestable out of their garden anymore. This variety is an interesting feature from this slide of the leaves. You see that some of the plants are entirely green, and others have purple and vigorous of that variety. And when we saw that when we were growing out the collard, we were wondering, okay, did we lose purity on this variety? Because it's not necessarily uniform. But Naomi confirmed that the variety has always done this. Some of the leaves, the plants are purple, and some of them are green, and that they've always stewarded the variety that way. So that's one example. I've got a couple others of stories where finding out the specifics of the history behind the variety is also really important for the stewardship practices, for knowing how to steward it in the future. If you want to preserve this Willis collard greens variety, then you wouldn't. If you want to preserve it as it was originally, then you want to maintain both of those color variations in the plant going forward as well. Another thing that we often deal with are the way that names can change or evolve or develop synonyms. This happens in the commercial seed trade, but it also happens among heirloom stewards when they're swapping varieties with one another. Sometimes there's things start to shift, or the name changes, or one person calls it one thing, and one person calls it another thing. So this whole list of names, these are all different names that have been used in the Seed Savers Exchange yearbook for the same variety. So there's a good solid half a dozen of them. It's all the same bean. This was a tango for our seed historian to try to figure out. But she figured out that it traces back to a woman named Lucina Kress of Ohio, who sent the variety to seed savers in the very early 1980s, which is part of why there's been some time for these different names to propagate. And part of the fundamental confusion is that Lucina didn't really have a name for the variety. It was just, and this is very common for heirloom varieties. It's just the variety that you grow, and it's the bean that we've always grown, and it may not have a particular name. And Lucina wrote about this variety. As far as I know, grandfather Abraham Rufner brought them from Switzerland in 1861. My mother is gone now, but always jealously guarded these beans. She came from a family of 10 children. Grandfather Abner Rufner came to America in 1861 at the age of 30 from Switzerland. He married another Swiss when he got to Southern Ohio. They had 10 children, and he died when he was pushed overboard from a boat in the Ohio River. My mother, the second youngest, was just a small child. I'm the only member of the family to keep these beans alive, so I'm glad for any help. So that's the story behind it, but it's been a very popular variety in the exchange, and because she didn't necessarily have a particular name for it, it developed all these different names in our collection. So one of the things that our seed historian decided after Lucina had passed away, but in reviewing Lucina's correspondence that we had from her, she decided that the name that Lucina most consistently used was Rufner Yellow. So that's what we call it in our collection now, and we're trying to encourage other people in the exchange to adopt that name for it too, just to help avoid future confusion. Some varieties are heirloom varieties that have a tie to a particular family, but also a larger community. So I wanted to talk about at least a couple examples of that. This is a radish called Seltzer Purple that came to us in fairly recently, in 2009, donated by Lyle Seltzer, who also listed this radish in the yearbook exchange. And Lyle wrote to us, my grandmother's grandfather came from the Nuremberg area in Germany. They came over in the 1850s. They first settled in New York. They came to the Amanas sometime in the 1860s. We have been living in the Amana area all of our lives. After my grandmother died in 1962, I've been raising the seed. It hasn't frosted here yet, and I have a crop of several hundred radishes ready to pick. Some are 5 to 6 inches long, and they're so sweet. The best crop is always in the fall. Lyle also said about his grandmother, Henrietta Seltzer, when I was a small boy, she showed me how to save seed. When she would pull radishes, she would save the nicest ones and cut the top off about 1 inch above the radish, and replant. The community that he was referencing is the Amana Colonies, which is an intentional community in central Iowa. It's a religious community, and it was a group that was established by a group of German immigrants that calls themselves the Community of True Inspiration. And they left Germany in the 1860s due to a lot of factors, but one of which was religious intolerance. They were having a lot of difficulties being able to practice their religion freely in Germany. And so they first settled in New York and lived there for a few decades, and then the entire community moved out to Iowa in the 1850s and 1860s and established there. And one of the things that was unique about this community is that they established communal ownership of all property. So they built several villages, and these villages are still standing today, the Amana Colonies. And they grew their food together in these large kitchen gardens. This is a picture of pre-1930 to communal kitchen garden in the Americanas. You can see some mills in the background and some buildings. They built buildings in the German tradition, a lot of brick buildings. And they had very diverse communities in terms of the different jobs and processes that they were working on in the mills. There were wood mills, woolen mills. They made a lot of crafts, and they were very self-sufficient. They grew most of their own food. They built most of their own equipment, and were very self-reliant on themselves. And they all went to the same church, this community of true inspiration. In 1932, they disbanded communal living, but because the generation that was coming up, the young people in the 1930s, were rebelling against it, and they were also finding it more difficult to be economically and socially isolated from the rest of the world. It wasn't working as well as it had in prior generations. So they disbanded communal living, but it's still a very intact community to this day. And this community has a whole set of alien varieties that have been passed down within that community that are still preserved today, of which the Seltzer radish is one. So that's an example of one that kind of exists in a larger community framework. And this is the radish growing in our display gardens.